I'm not a great candidate for overthrowing a government just in general, so I don't know if I am necessarily qualified to speak about this. Well, hello. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Ashley. Today we're going to talk dystopian novels. They suck, right? Kind of? Sometimes. No, I don't know. That's why we're talking about this video, so that I can organize my thoughts. So let's start with the definition of a dystopian novel from the Googles. A dystopian is related to an imagined state or society where there's a lot of suffering or great injustice. That's it. So basically the world's open from there. And I think it's really interesting and important to note that dystopian novels kind of come in waves. So this time, what's interesting about dystopian novels is that they're specifically aimed at teenagers and young adults. And I'm not sure at what point you stop qualifying somebody as a young adult. Like, it's not like you hit 30 and all of a sudden it's like, well, you now an old adult. Like, like we don't say you're an old adult, we say the elderly, but there's like this awkward gap where like, are you a young adult? Are you an old adult? Are you in the awkward middle stages? Like, is this like teenage years of adulthood till you're like in your 60s and then all of a sudden you're a mature old adult? Like, the distinctions are not clear to me. Anyway, so I'm going to say that I'm a young adult reader. I'm sure anybody who's 90 would say, yes, young adult right there, you don't know nothing. Anyway, so we're gonna go with that. Anyway, so lots of literature aimed at young adults. And something that's really interesting about the fact that it's for young adults now is that these young adult stories tend to be a lot more positive than I feel like dystopians generally would lead you to believe, right? Like if we have a gigantic government collapse and there's a new government in place, that society we would probably look at as pretty depressing, and lots of people die in those kind of environments and societies, and that probably means the hero's gonna die too, like 9 times out of 10. But in young adult literature, that trend doesn't always work. If the main hero dies, their sacrifice probably means that it brought about a change in the government, like almost guaranteed. Most people, and like most of the people, make it out fairly unscathed, pretty alive. Like so there's just a lot more of a positive, we can do this, we can change the world kind of a vibe from young adult dystopian fantasy, which is really interesting because I don't think it's realistic, which it doesn't have to be, because like, let's all acknowledge that this is fiction and it doesn't matter because it's all made up anyway, but it's also something to discuss. I don't know how I feel about dystopians. I'm deeply drawn to them. Like, if you tell me that a book has a dystopian theme or feel to it, I'm like, I'm here for this. Give me the dirt, give me the tea, I want to know. And then like halfway through the book, I'm like, am I liking this? Not really. And then I finish the book and I'm like, I don't like dystopians. And then somebody else will come and be like, hey, I have a book about dystopians. And I'm like, oh, really? Ooh, I want it. Can I have some? Can I have some? Like I think something's going to have changed. So I'm trying to figure out what's going on here, because I really like the idea of reading dystopian novels and not so much the practice of them. And I don't know if that's a misinterpretation on my part, and that's just me growing up and being like, no, turns out I don't actually like this book. I don't actually like this genre. Who'd have thunk? Let's dig into that. Like, what are some of the reasons that dystopian literature is good or worthy of reading or like fun? First of all, I think it's kind of a defense mechanism on some levels, just because it allows you to play out a scenario without actually being in any danger. Like, for example, what would it be like if people were forced to fight each other to the death? Hunger Games. What would it be like to have one quality that defines you and that one quality separates you from every other people? It's the Divergent series. What would it be like if you were forced to compete for a prince's hand in marriage while also trying to, orchestrate and overthrow the monarchy? That's the Selection series. These series in these dystopian worlds, they help us explore themes that we kind of are curious about, and I think we're attracted to those worlds and the idea of like, well, what would it be like if people were forced to fight to the death? Like, how would that play out? How would that affect people? Like, what would happen there? And that makes us really curious. Dystopians also allow people to give a kind of social commentary on the things that are happening. So, for example, The Hunger Games tends to talk a lot about how the differences between a high or high class and low class, so rich and poor, how they interact with each other, how they view each other, like how that interaction tends to play out, and the class lines, divergent comments on what are major parts of people's personalities and why do people tend to clump together and what makes those clumpings of people interact well or not well with each other. And the matched society comments on a government that regulates every part of your life, which I think is a big fear that people have, is that the government will get involved and monitor and talk about every part of your life, and you will be less and less involved with the functions of your own life. So like these are commentaries on things that maybe are already afraid of that are happening, or we see as like, oh, wait bro, I see that coming. So we're kind of curious about, what does this say about our society? And I wouldn't be surprised if we swing back at all towards dystopian. Well, I guess we'll keep in mind with the metaphor. If we swing back a little bit towards dystopian, if we start having books that focus a lot more on how race relations intersect. What am I trying to say here? How race relations interact and play out in a dystopian world, as well as more feminist ideals, which is a big criticism of dystopian literature as it stands now, that they don't deal at all with feminist problems or diversity or racism problems. And if you want to know more about that, there's some articles down below. I don't feel qualified enough to talk about those just yet, so read those links down there. Also, not to mention, like, there's just the main protagonist, who's usually a teenager or a very young adult. They feel like they don't know where their place in society is. They don't know how to fit in. They feel like their personality is off. They feel weird and unbalanced and awkward, and like all the things that you feel in a teenage body just because you're growing up. like that's, you have all that, and then it's combined and exerted on by outside forces and pressures, and you kind of want to see how that plays out just for that teenager, and that makes it relatable. That makes these characters interesting and relatable and valuable, I think, as a commentary both on just like normal life along with society and whatever else we're going to talk about. But even with all of these amazing facts, I still sometimes find that I have a really bad taste for dystopian novels, because it just doesn't feel realistic that we have all of these governments getting toppled. Like, I mean, I don't want to throw shade at anybody, but there's an awful lot of teenagers overthrowing governments in these novels. And maybe I was just a bored teenager, but like, I never ever attempted to throw my government. Like, never. And I mean, in full disclosure, I never skipped class. I always turned my homework in. I never got suspended. I never toppled governments before breakfast. Never set up a successful dictatorship. So like, I'm not great material. I'm not a great candidate for overthrowing a government just in general. So I don't know if I am necessarily qualified to speak about this. But I do have a hard time believing that any teenager could topple a government, or that any adults would be willing to let them take responsibility for that. Like, just be like, here, I see that you are a somewhat qualified human being who is in early pubescence. Go forth, topple the government. I don't see that happening. I mean, and let me, just check how many teens have led revolutions and overthrown the governments. That'd be a grand total of zero successful revolutions led by teenagers. Or is it? Because if you count activism as a current day thought revolution, then the count all of a sudden gets really high, because there are teens worldwide who are actively making a difference in the world that they live in. Like, for example, we have Malala Yousafzai, who as a teen talked a lot about the fact that girls have a right to be just as educated in the Middle East, and was shot for that. We have Jack Cable, who at 18 hacked a business's security system and then notified them of the fact that they had a flaw in their system, and now he's an ethical hacker. We have Rashib Jain, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, but at 14, this kid created software that can more accurately track the pancreas and give better results when testing for cancer. Like, not to mention, we have thousands upon thousands of teenagers who are currently protesting in the Black Lives Matters and the Me Too movements, they're actively involved in politics and making sure that the people they believe in get voted into office? Is it an active revolution if you fight against mainstream thought and belief for things that you feel like need to be protected and that need a voice? Like, it's a revolution of thought for sure. I mean, I originally came into this thinking there's no way that a teenager could overthrow a government. That's ridiculous and ludicrous, and there's no way it's believable, even in fiction. But we have real teens doing a lot of real things in our real world. The Taliban were so afraid of Malala Yousafzai speaking about education that they shot her. Like, they were afraid of what she was talking about, and they were afraid that it would influence what they're trying to do. Like, they're afraid of her and they want to silence her. She's a young adult. She's a teenager. So that makes me wonder then, maybe teenagers have a lot more impact if they're provided with more opportunity and more support from their families. Like, that blows my mind. That's what I'm saying is I wasted my teenage years, but I haven't wasted my young adult years, because we've already decided, we a young adult, we got lots of time to change something. We'll work on that. We'll add that to my list of things to do. Eat breakfast, do dishes, change world. We'll work on that. Anyway, so where does that leave us? Are dystopians helpful or are they harmful? I mean, you can't really throw an entire genre under the bus, so it probably depends on the book and the series. But I do think that they show us an interesting peek into human nature. And like, maybe what they're showing us is that teenagers have a lot more power and authority and ability than we give them credit for, and putting it in a fictional backdrop maybe is to disguise the fact that they have a lot more power than we give them credit for. I don't know. I do think there's something more to these books than awkward love triangles and evil overlords. Anyway, that aside, I'm excited to read some more dystopian literature. I found lots of recommendations and advice on new ones, so we'll be discussing those coming up. Anyway, but tell me in the comments, do you like dystopian novels? Do you read dystopian novels? Do you hate them? Let me know. I would like to read them with my eyeballs. Anyway, I'll talk to you down below. Later, alligator.